Don't open it here, the old man said, pressing a manila envelope into my hands at my grandfather's graveside. Wait until you're alone, and whatever you find inside, call this number first before you do anything else. He was gone before I could ask his name. I remember the cold more than anything. It was February in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and the ground had that hard, resigned look it gets after a long winter. My grandfather had been buried 20 minutes earlier. The service was small. My uncle, my mom, two men from the VFW post who had driven 3 hours and didn't say much. A chaplain who read from a laminated card. That was it. My grandfather had served in the army for 26 years, 2 tours in Vietnam, one in the Gulf. He retired a master sergeant and spent the next 3 decades fixing lawnmowers out of a shed behind his house in Fayetteville. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't put anything on the walls. He drove a truck with a faded bumper sticker that said Airborne, and that was the most he ever announced himself. He died at 79. Congestive heart failure. He had called me the week before to tell me the dogwood in his backyard had bloomed early and that he thought that probably meant something. I told him I'd come visit in April. I didn't make it to April. The man who handed me the envelope was old himself, maybe late 70s, straight-backed, wearing a dark coat that looked military in its cut without being a uniform. He hadn't been at the graveside. He had appeared at the edge of the cemetery the way people do when they aren't sure they're welcome but have decided to come anyway. I noticed him because he was standing very still while everyone else was shifting their weight against the cold. He shook my hand with both of his, told me my grandfather had been one of the finest men he'd ever known. Said it the way someone says something they've been carrying for a long time and are relieved to finally put down. Then he gave me the envelope and told me not to open it there. My uncle was at my elbow before I could turn around. He'd driven down from Raleigh that morning and was already talking about the drive back. He had a way of making every occasion feel like an inconvenience he was graciously tolerating. Who was that? He asked. I don't know, I said. He glanced at the envelope. What's that? I don't know that either. He looked at me with an expression I recognized, a kind of watchful transactional interest he had worn my whole life whenever the subject of my grandfather's estate came up. My grandfather owned his house outright and had a small savings account and not much else, as far as anyone knew. My uncle had been quietly noting this for years. Paperwork, probably, I said, and put the envelope in my coat pocket. That night, I sat alone in my grandfather's kitchen. My mom had gone back to her hotel. My uncle had driven to Raleigh. The house smelled like sawdust and instant coffee and the particular silence of a place where someone has lived alone for a very long time. His reading glasses were folded on the kitchen table next to a crossword puzzle he hadn't finished. The clue he'd stopped on was 7 letters. Quiet strength. He'd written in 4 letters and stopped. I didn't try to finish it. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds and a small index card with a phone number written in ink. No area code I recognized. Below the number, 2 words. First, Federal. The letter was handwritten. The penmanship was careful, deliberate, the kind men of a certain generation learned in school and never lost. I served with your grandfather in 71 and again in 89. He was the best soldier I ever stood next to and a better man than that. There are things he arranged that he never had the chance to tell you about. Call the number. Give them his full name and your name. They'll be ready for you. It was signed with a first name only, Gerald. I turned the index card over. Nothing on the back. No last name, no address, no explanation. I wasn't someone who chased mysteries. I was a second-grade teacher in Wilmington. I drove a 4-year-old Civic. I graded papers on Sunday nights and called my grandfather on Saturday mornings. My life was ordinary in the ways I had chosen for it to be ordinary, and I had been at peace with that. But I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, looking at 2 words I didn't understand. First, Federal. I opened my grandfather's junk drawer. Every old man has one, and found the usual contents. Batteries of uncertain charge, a Swiss Army knife, hardware store receipts, a rubber-banded stack of birthday cards he'd saved, mine included, going back to when I was 7, and had drawn him a picture of a helicopter because I knew he'd jumped out of them. In the back of the drawer, under a flashlight that no longer worked, I found a small leather portfolio, the kind that zips around 3 sides. Inside were documents, insurance policies, the deed to the house, his discharge papers. I had seen versions of all of this before. But underneath everything, in a plain white envelope with nothing written on the outside, I found statements. Financial statements. Quarterly, going back 11 years from an institution I had never heard of. The balance on the most recent one made me set the paper down on the table and look out the window for a moment before I picked it up again. My grandfather had not been a wealthy man. He had fixed lawnmowers. He clipped grocery coupons. He wore the same boots for 15 years. The number on that statement did not belong to the man I thought I knew. I called my mom before I called the number on the card. It was late, but she answered on the second ring. "Did you know about any account?" I asked. "Anything financially never mentioned?" She was quiet for a moment. "He always said he was fine," she said. "I never pushed. I found something," I said. She asked what, and I told her I wasn't sure yet and that I would call her in the morning when I knew more. I could hear in her silence that she was doing the same arithmetic I had been doing, trying to square the man we knew against the document in my hand. After I hung up, I looked at the number on the index card for a long time. My uncle called at 9 the next morning. He had a habit of calling early when he thought there was something to know. "Just checking in," he said, "seeing how you're holding up." My uncle and I had always been polite to each other in the way that people are polite when they share blood, but not much else. He was my mother's older brother. He had borrowed money from my grandfather twice that I knew of, maybe more times that I didn't. He never repaid it in the way that some people never repay things, not because they forget, but because they've decided the debt belongs to a different version of themselves than the one standing in front of you now. "I'm okay," I said. "The house is going to need to be dealt with," he said. "Estate-wise, I've already talked to a probate attorney up here." "He just died yesterday," I said. "I know. I'm just saying when you're ready, we should coordinate." I told him I would be in touch. I didn't tell him about the envelope, or the statements, or the 2 words on the index card. I called the number that afternoon. A man answered on the third ring. His voice was professional, measured. When I gave my grandfather's name, there was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that comes when someone is switching into a different kind of attention. "We've been expecting this call," he said. "I'm very sorry for your loss." He asked if I could come in person. I asked where they were located. "We have an office in Charlotte," he said. "Whenever you're ready. There's no urgency, but there is some paperwork that requires your signature in person." I drove to Charlotte 2 days later. I didn't tell my uncle. The office was in a quiet part of uptown Charlotte, in one of those buildings that projects understated seriousness. No flashy lobby, no marble fountain, just dark wood and good lighting and the kind of quiet that costs money to maintain. A woman at the reception desk asked my name and made a call without typing anything, which I noticed. A man in a gray suit came out to greet me. He introduced himself as the account manager and led me to a conference room that looked out over the city. He expressed his condolences again and then opened a folder. "My grandfather had established an account here in 2009, he explained. It had been funded through consistent contributions over the years, beginning modestly and growing through a disciplined investment strategy. Conservative holdings, long-term positions, no withdrawals." "How much?" I asked before I meant to. He turned the folder to face me. The number was larger than the quarterly statement had suggested, because the quarterly statement had been for one of several accounts. Together they represented something I did not have a framework for. Not a fortune by any national headline standard, but enough to change the direction of multiple lives. Enough to matter enormously to people it hadn't reached yet. "I don't understand," I said. "He fixed lawn mowers. He saved," the account manager said simply, "and he was patient. He told me my grandfather had been clear about his intentions from the beginning. The accounts were structured as a trust, not for personal accumulation, for a specific purpose." He slid a second folder across the table. The trust had been established in support of the families of soldiers who had served under my grandfather's command over his career, particularly those who had been killed in action or come home with injuries the government support systems hadn't fully addressed. Medical expenses, mortgage assistance for widows, college tuition for children who had grown up without fathers. The distributions had been going out quietly for over a decade. I sat with that for a moment. He never said anything, I said. Not once. The account manager looked at me with an expression I would remember later. Not pity, something more like recognition. He asked us specifically not to contact his family unless he passed, he said. He wanted it handled quietly. Why? He left a letter that addresses that, the man said. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name was written on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. I put it in my bag. I wasn't ready to open it in that room. On the drive back to Fayetteville, I pulled over once on a stretch of highway outside of Kannapolis and sat with the car running for about 10 minutes looking at the road. I wasn't crying. I was doing the thing you do when something you believe to be true about a person turns out to be only partially true, and you have to make room for the rest of it. My grandfather had not been a small man. I had always known that. But I had understood his smallness, his modest house, his simple routines, his refusal of attention as the whole of him. It wasn't. It was a method. My uncle called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again an hour later and I answered. I've been thinking, he said, that we should probably get a full accounting of the estate before we move forward with anything. I'm still looking into things, I said, because there may be assets that weren't obvious, he said carefully. Pop was always a little private about finances. The word pop in his mouth sounded proprietary in a way it hadn't before. I'll let you know when I know more, I said. He paused. I just want to make sure this is handled equitably. I opened my grandfather's letter that night, alone at his kitchen table, under the lamp he'd had since before my mother was born. His handwriting was the same as it had been in life, even, unhurried, each letter formed with the same patience he applied to everything else. If you're reading this, then Gerald found you, and you've been to Charlotte, and now you're probably trying to make sense of it. Let me help. I started the trust in 2009 after Jimmy Calloway's widow lost her house. Jimmy was one of mine. He stepped on something in Mosul in 2004 and came home in a box. And 8 years later, his wife was losing the house because the VA had made some mistake in the paperwork and nobody helped her fix it. I fixed it. And then I kept going. I didn't tell your mother or your uncle because money changes people. Not always, but often enough that I didn't want to test it. I wanted the money to go where it was supposed to go. I believed you would understand that. You are the trustee. I filed the paperwork in 2018 when you finished your degree. I watched you long enough to know you were the right one. The trust has enough to continue for another 20 years at the current distribution rate. You don't have to do anything dramatic. You just have to keep it steady. That's all I ever did. Don't let your uncle dissolve it. He'll try. I love you. I was proud of you from the start. I just didn't say it enough because that's a mistake I made and I'm sorry for it. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. My uncle's call came the next morning, earlier than before. He had spoken with his probate attorney again, he said. It was possible that my grandfather had accounts that hadn't been disclosed in the will. If that was the case, Virginia law, he said Virginia. Even though my grandfather had lived in North Carolina for 40 years, which told me he hadn't fully thought this through yet, required those assets to be included in the estate distribution. He lived in North Carolina, I said. A pause. Right, North Carolina. Still, the principle stands. If there are assets, I'll be in touch, I said. He was quiet for a moment. You found something. I didn't answer that. I'm not the enemy here, he said. I just want to be treated fairly. There was something in that word, fairly, that I had heard before. Not from him specifically. From the general posture of someone who has decided, in advance of the facts, that they are owed something. I called a trust attorney in Wilmington that afternoon, a woman named Patricia, that a colleague at my school had used for her mother's estate. She was practical, warm, and thorough in the way that good attorneys are. She didn't waste your time telling you things were complicated when they weren't, and she didn't simplify things that required care. I drove to her office that Friday with the trust documents, my grandfather's letter, and the account statements from Charlotte. She reviewed everything over the course of an hour, asking questions in a quiet, methodical way. When she finished, she looked up. "This is solid," she said. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing, or he had someone help him who did." "Gerald," I said, thinking of the man at the cemetery. "Whoever it was," she said, "this is going to hold. Your uncle can file a claim if he wants to. He won't succeed. The trust predates any plausible argument, it's properly documented, and the distributions are auditable." "He'll file anyway," I said. She nodded. "They usually do." My uncle filed a claim against the estate 4 weeks later through his Richmond attorney, citing lack of full disclosure and requesting an accounting of all assets held in trust or otherwise. The language was formal and bloodless, the way legal language is when someone wants to take something from you without sounding like they want to take something from you. I let my attorney handle the responses. She was patient and thorough and seemed mildly unbothered by all of it, which helped me stay mildly unbothered by it too. In the meantime, I had begun to understand the trust more fully. My grandfather's account manager in Charlotte walked me through the existing beneficiaries, 6 families currently receiving regular support. I didn't know the names, but I knew the shapes of their situations. A widow in Fayetteville whose husband had served with my grandfather in the Gulf and come home with a TBI that had slowly taken his ability to work. A man in Georgia, now in his 50s, who had lost his leg outside of Kandahar and spent years fighting for disability compensation while working part-time. 2 daughters in Tennessee whose father had been killed in 2003 and who were now in college, their tuition paid out of a fund their mother had never been able to explain fully to them. These were not abstractions. They were people my grandfather had watched, tracked, and quietly supplemented for years without ever saying so at a family dinner. The first hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Wake County because that's where my uncle's attorney had filed. I drove up the night before and stayed at a Hampton Inn. I ate a sandwich in my room and reread my grandfather's letter one more time. Not because I needed to, but because it steadied me. The courtroom was nothing like television. It was a plain room with fluorescent lights and a window that looked out on a parking garage. My uncle was already seated at the opposing table when I came in. He didn't look at me. He looked like a man who had told himself a story about the situation that required everyone else to play a specific role, and was annoyed that no one had memorized their lines. The judge was a methodical woman who asked clear questions and tolerated nothing extraneous. My attorney presented the trust documents, the funding history, the disbursement records, the timeline going back to 2009. My uncle's attorney argued that the trust represented assets that should have been disclosed to heirs and that the sole trustee arrangement was designed to exclude rightful beneficiaries. My attorney responded calmly. The trust was established 16 years ago. It had been referenced in the will, not itemized, but referenced, which satisfied North Carolina's disclosure requirements. The trustee was named explicitly and with legal authority. There was no evidence of undue influence. Gerald appeared as a witness. He walked in without ceremony and took the stand with the ease of someone who had given testimony before in situations that mattered more than this one. He was calm and direct. He had known my grandfather since 1971. He had been aware of the trust's purpose from the beginning. He had assisted my grandfather in identifying the initial beneficiaries. No one had pressured or manipulated my grandfather into anything. The trust was entirely his idea and entirely his decision. My uncle's attorney tried to suggest that Gerald's influence had shaped the trust in ways that disadvantaged the family. Gerald looked at him with an expression of patient composure. "He didn't take advice from me on this," Gerald said. "He gave it." The judge recessed and returned within 20 minutes. She dismissed my uncle's claim. The trust was valid. The distribution structure would remain intact. Outside the courthouse, my uncle stood by his car. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. "I could have handled it differently," he said finally. "Yes," I said. "He should have told me." There was something in his voice that wasn't entirely about money, and I recognized it because I had heard it before in different forms. Old grief. The particular hurt of someone who never felt fully seen by the person whose opinion mattered most. He saw you, I said. He just worried about what the money would do. My uncle was quiet for a moment. That's not the same as trusting me. No, I said. It's not. He drove away, and I stood in the parking lot for a while before I got in my car. The trust continued. The distributions went out on schedule. The woman in Fayetteville kept her mortgage current. The man in Georgia had his medical transportation covered through the end of the year. The two sisters in Tennessee started their spring semesters. I kept teaching. I kept my apartment in Wilmington. I drove to Fayetteville on weekends, to my grandfather's house, which I had decided not to sell yet, not because I needed it, but because I wasn't done being in it. My uncle called in the spring, 3 months after the ruling. He didn't make small talk. I want to understand it better, he said. The trust. What it does. I told him. Not as a lecture. The way you explain something to someone when you're both sitting at a kitchen table and there's no reason to perform anything. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He really did all that, he said when I finished. For people he served with, for their families, I said. He was quiet. He helped you too, I said, more than once. That was different. I know, I said, but it wasn't nothing. I visited my uncle in Raleigh in June. His house was a little different than I remembered. A project he'd started and not finished in the front hall, dishes on the counter, the general look of a person who was managing but not comfortable. He'd had a difficult few years, business that didn't take off, bills that had a way of multiplying. We sat on his back porch and drank iced tea and didn't talk about the lawsuit. We talked about my grandfather, the things he'd said, the things he'd fixed, the particular way he had of ending a conversation that let you know he was done and comfortable about it. He never said he was proud of me, my uncle said at one point. Not bitterly, just factually. He didn't say it to me out loud either, I said. He wrote it. My uncle looked at me. I didn't show him the letter. That felt like something private between me and my grandfather. But I told him what it said, that my grandfather had watched, that he had paid attention, that silence wasn't the same as absence. The trust has a provision I hadn't understood at first. There's a family stabilization clause, modest and structured, that my grandfather built in. It allows for direct family assistance in cases of documented financial hardship, provided the assistance is structured through an approved debt repayment plan and a financial counselor assigned by the trust. It wasn't a blank check, it was a hand extended under conditions. I offered it to my uncle that afternoon on the porch. He sat with it for a long time. You want to put conditions on how I spend money, he said. I want to continue what he started, I said. Which is what? Helping people without enabling the problem that made them need help. My uncle looked out at his yard. There was a maple tree in the back corner that had been there longer than his house. He looked at it the way people look at things when they're thinking about something else entirely. I don't want to be managed, he said. I'm not offering to manage you, I said. I'm offering to help you get somewhere different than where you are. He didn't answer right away. Let me think about it, he said finally. He called me 2 weeks later and said yes. I drove back to Fayetteville on a Saturday in October, the first one that felt properly like fall. The dogwood in my grandfather's backyard had dropped its leaves and was already looking ahead to spring in the bare, patient way that trees do. I sat in his chair by the window where he used to drink his coffee. The house was quiet but not empty feeling. There's a difference, and it takes a while to learn it. I thought about the man I had believed my grandfather to be. Practical, quiet, a little withholding, defined by what he didn't have and didn't say. And I thought about the man I had spent the past 8 months discovering. Deliberate, watchful, patient in a way that required decades to understand. He hadn't been hiding, he had been building. There's a line in his letter I keep coming back to. I believed you would understand that. Not hoped. Believed. I am 31 years old, and I teach second grade, and I drive a 4-year-old Civic, and I am the trustee of something that outlived the man who made it and will outlive me if I do my part. I didn't choose that. He chose it for me. And I've spent enough time now living inside his choice to understand why he made it. Not because I was the best candidate, because I would hold it steady. My grandfather fixed lawnmowers for 30 years. He woke up every morning in the same house and drank his coffee at the same time and never once put anything on the walls. He didn't need anyone to know. Some people build loudly. They want monuments and ceremonies and names on buildings. My grandfather built the way he did everything, at the right pace without announcement, in the direction of what mattered. Steady was enough. Steady was everything. If your grandfather, or your father, or your mother, or someone you knew who didn't make noise about who they were, came to mind while you were listening, I hope you sit with that for a moment. Call them if you still can. And if you can't, then carry the part of them that was steady. That's what they left you. That's the whole inheritance. There's a crossword puzzle still sitting on my grandfather's kitchen table. 7 letters. Quiet strength. He filled in 4 and stopped. I've never finished it either, and I don't think I will. For most of my life, I thought I understood him. A man of routines and few words, a shed full of lawnmowers, a bumper sticker that said airborne and nothing else. I thought his quietness was just his personality, that he was someone who didn't have much to say because not much had happened worth saying. I was wrong about all of it. What I've come to understand, slowly, is that the way he lived was a kind of answer, not to a question I had asked him, but to one I hadn't known I was living inside. The question of what it looks like when someone does the right thing without an audience, without credit, without even the comfort of being understood by the people closest to them. My grandfather watched his uncle take shortcuts his whole life, borrow money, leave things half-finished, treat every relationship like a transaction with a vague due date. And my grandfather just kept going in the other direction. Not because he was angry about it, not because he was trying to prove something, because he had decided somewhere early on that the standard he held himself to wasn't negotiable. That's what I mean when I say he was a moral man. Not in a preachy sense, not in a Sunday school sense, but in the plainest possible sense. He knew what was right, and he did it, even when nobody was watching. Especially then. And he was smart about it in a way I'm still learning to be. He didn't just feel strongly about helping the families of the men he'd served with. He built something. He thought it through, filed the paperwork, chose a trustee, wrote the letter. He understood that good intentions without structure don't last. That love without discipline is just sentiment. He turned a feeling into a system that would outlive him by decades. That takes a different kind of intelligence than the kind that shows up on tests or resumes. It's the kind that looks 20 years ahead and builds accordingly. And then he held the line, year after year, quietly without telling anyone, not even my mom, not even me. There must have been moments when it would have been easier to withdraw the funds, to simplify, to just give everyone the money and be done with it. He didn't, he kept going. That steadiness, that refusal to give up on what he built just because it was inconvenient or invisible, is the thing I keep coming back to. My uncle fought it. He filed his claim and sat across a courtroom table from me and asked for his share of something he hadn't known existed until it was already spoken for. I don't blame him the way I used to. He grew up next to the same quiet man I did and came away feeling overlooked. That's real. That hurt shaped him. But what I've learned is that the hurt doesn't excuse the choice. He chose to fight for money instead of asking what the money meant. And I chose differently. That's the whole story in a way. The same inheritance, 2 different responses. I'm 31 years old, and I hold something my grandfather built across 3 decades. I didn't earn it by being exceptional. I earned it by being steady enough, long enough for him to trust me with it. That's both humbling and clarifying. It tells me exactly what I'm supposed to do next. Keep going. Fill in the rest of the letters. Not for recognition. Just because the crossword is still on the table and someone should finish it.